Extraterrestrial nightmare studies conclude human terror tolerance exceeds all known limits. Part 1. Doctor stood in the observation room, his four eyes focused on the monitors before him. After 30 years of studying fear across the galaxy, he thought he had seen everything. He had tested 847 different species, each one breaking in predictable ways when faced with their deepest terrors. Today would be different, though he did not know it yet. The research station floated in the darkness above a dead moon. Inside its walls, the most advanced fear-testing technology in the known universe waited to be used. The consortium of advanced species had built this place for one purpose: to find the breaking points of every civilization that wanted to join them. It was necessary work. Space was dangerous, filled with things that could shatter minds as easily as bodies. Better to know the limits now than to watch a species collapse when they encountered true horror among the stars. The human volunteers arrived on schedule. There were 12 of them, a mix of soldiers, scientists, and ordinary civilians. They wore simple gray jumpsuits and seemed relaxed, chatting with each other as they entered the testing chamber. Found this concerning. Most species arrived silent and tense, already afraid of what was coming. The humans acted like they were going on a field trip. His assistant stood beside him. She was in, her crystalline body glowing soft blue with curiosity. "Doctor, should we review the protocols again? The translation matrix confirms they understand what will happen." "They understand," said. "I'm not sure they believe it." He had explained everything clearly. The test would expose them to scenarios designed to trigger fear responses. These were not random scares. Each scenario was built from deep evolutionary programming, the kind of terror that lived in the genetic memory of every thinking species. Darkness and isolation, predators in the night, the death of everything they loved. The scenarios increased in intensity, and every species had a point where their minds simply stopped working correctly. The bravest species ever tested, the warrior race called the, had made it through 7 scenarios before their hearts nearly stopped from pure terror. The humans had been told all of this. One of them, a middle-aged woman with short dark hair, had raised her hand and asked if they would get lunch afterward. Another, a younger man covered in colorful tattoos, wanted to know if he could take notes, had not known how to respond. "Beginning Scenario 1, he announced, activating the neural interface. The humans would experience everything as absolutely real, pulled directly from their own evolutionary fears. Isolation Protocol. The scenario was simple and devastating. Each human would find themselves alone in perfect darkness, cut off from all sensory input except the knowledge that they were utterly, completely alone. Most species began screaming within minutes. Some tried to claw their own eyes out to create sensation, any sensation. The humans sat quietly for the full 10-minute cycle. Their heart rates elevated slightly. Some showed signs of discomfort on the biometric readings. When the scenario ended, they blinked and looked around at each other. "That was weird," one of them said. "Like sensory deprivation tanks back home." "You have devices that do this voluntarily." His glow shifted to confused yellow. "Sure," the tattooed man said. "They're supposed to be relaxing. Some people pay good money for it." Felt the first stirring of doubt. He pushed it aside and activated Scenario 2, Pursuit by Apex Predators. This one worked on 99% of all tested species. The fear of being hunted was nearly universal. The humans tensed immediately. Their breathing quickened, pupils dilated, and they began moving in the virtual space. But they were not running blindly. They were thinking, organizing. Within 2 minutes, they had formed into groups, found improvised weapons in the scenario, and created defensive positions. One of them, a woman named Sarah, called out tactical advice to the others. When it ended, they were breathing hard but alert. One man was grinning. That was intense, like a really good survival horror game. "A game?" asked, his voice flat with disbelief. "Yeah, for fun. We have lots of games where things chase you and try to kill you. Turned nearly white with shock. You simulate being hunted to death for entertainment. Well, yeah, Sarah said, wiping sweat from her forehead. I mean, nobody actually dies, but the adrenaline rush is great. Moved through scenarios 3, 4, and 5 with increasing urgency. Body horror, where their forms twisted into impossible shapes. Betrayal by loved ones. The destruction of their entire planet while they watched helplessly. Each one should have shattered them. Each one was designed to find the pressure points in the psyche and crush them. The humans cried during Scenario 5. Tears ran down their faces as they watched Earth burn in nuclear fire. But they did not break. They held each other. They spoke quietly about what they would do, how they would rebuild, who they would save. Their grief was real and deep, but underneath it, their minds kept working. "This is not possible," whispered. She was flickering rapidly through colors now, unable to process what she was seeing. The collapse at Scenario 7. These humans have shown more emotional distress from losing at their own games than from watching their world die. I know, said. His hands were shaking slightly. In 30 years he had never been uncertain. The protocols worked. The science was sound. But the data on his screens told a story that should not exist. He made a decision that would haunt him. There were scenarios beyond 7. They were theoretical, never tested because no ethics board would approve them. Scenario 10 was called the Omega Protocol. It was designed to represent the ultimate fear, cosmic meaninglessness, the heat death of the universe, the absolute certainty that nothing mattered and never had. It combined existential dread with sensory and psychological torture in ways that computer models suggested would destroy any consciousness exposed to it. Dr. No said when she saw what he was doing. That scenario is not approved. It could cause permanent damage. We need to know, said. Look at them. They are not normal. If we allow them into the consortium without understanding this, without finding their limits, we could be making a terrible mistake. He activated Scenario 10 without warning. The humans stiffened in their chairs as the protocol took hold. Watched their biometrics carefully, ready to shut it down if anyone approached critical levels. Minutes passed. Their stress hormones spiked, then stabilized. Their brain activity showed patterns he had never seen before, whole sections lighting up in sequence as if they were processing the existential horror as data, breaking it down into manageable pieces. After the full 15-minute cycle, the scenario ended. The humans sat in silence. Some were pale, others were crying quietly. All of them looked exhausted, but all of them were still conscious, still thinking, still present. Sarah looked directly at the observation window, though she could not see through it. Her eyes were red but steady. "Is there a Scenario 11?" she asked. "Because we have stories like this back home. We call them Tuesday." Another human, a man named, laughed weakly. "Yeah, this is like every story ever written, except with better graphics." "Who is?" asked through the intercom, his voice barely steady. "Human writer from about 200 years ago," explained, still catching his breath. "He wrote stories about cosmic horror, about how the universe is full of things so big and terrible that just knowing they exist can drive you insane. Really cheerful stuff. Kids read it in school. Children read stories designed to cause existential dread." "Sure," Sarah said, standing up on shaky legs. "Look, that was rough. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But it's not like we haven't thought about this stuff before. Every human who has ever looked up at the stars and felt small has touched on these ideas. We have entire branches of philosophy dedicated to figuring out how to live in a universe that does not care if we exist. We have been practicing existential dread since we learned to think." Sat down slowly in his chair. Had gone completely clear, a sign of absolute shock in her species. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally managed to say, "I need to write a report about this. The consortium is not going to believe it." "Are we done for today?" Sarah asked. "Because honestly, I could really use that lunch now." As the humans left the testing chamber, talking among themselves about which scenario was the scariest, comparing it to various movies and books and games had never heard of, he realized something terrifying. He had spent 3 decades learning how to break minds with fear. The humans had spent thousands of years learning how to live with it. Part 2. The consortium flags report as a system error within 6 hours of submission. The message was polite but firm. Recalibrate all equipment and rerun the tests. No species could function through Scenario 10. The data must be corrupted. Recalibrated everything. He ran diagnostic checks 3 times. He brought in an independent technician, an engineer with 6 arms and a reputation for perfection, who spent 2 days examining every circuit and neural pathway in the testing system. Everything was working exactly as designed. The second round of tests produced identical results. The humans walked through scenarios that should have reduced them to catatonic husks and came out asking thoughtful questions about the technology involved. The soldier in the group wanted to know if the fear simulation could be used for training exercises. The scientist asked for copies of the biometric data for a paper she was writing. The consortium sent an oversight team. While waiting for them to arrive, did something he had never done in 30 years of research. He invited the human subjects to join him for informal conversations. He needed to understand what he was seeing, and the test data was not enough. Sarah became his primary interview subject, mostly because she volunteered. They sat in the station's small observation lounge, looking out at the dead moon below, and talked about fear. "What do you want to know?" Sarah asked, sipping something the humans called coffee that smelled vaguely toxic to senses. "Why are you not afraid?" he asked bluntly. "I have studied fear my entire life. What I showed you should have broken you. It has broken every other species, but you act like it was merely unpleasant." Sarah considered this carefully. "I did not say I was not afraid. I was terrified. Scenario 10 was one of the worst experiences of my life, but being afraid and being broken are different things. We have always been afraid. Our whole history is about being scared and doing things anyway." "Explain," said, leaning forward. "Okay, so humans evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill us. We were not the strongest or fastest or most dangerous thing out there. We were prey animals for most of our evolution. Things hunted us in the dark. We had to learn to be afraid of everything: tigers and snakes and spiders and the dark and the deep water and heights and strangers and disease and 1,000 other things. Fear kept us alive." "This is true of many species," noted. "Right, but here is the thing. We were also curious and creative and stubborn. We could not stop being afraid, our brains would not let us, but we also could not stop exploring and trying new things. So we learned to be afraid and functional at the same time. We learned to push through the fear, and then we started practicing." "Practicing fear?" Sarah smiled slightly. "We tell each other scary stories. We have been doing it since before we had written language. Humans would gather around fires at night and tell tales about monsters and ghosts and terrible things in the darkness. We made up fears to practice being afraid. As we got more advanced, we wrote horror novels and made horror films and created video games where terrible things hunt you. We have an entire entertainment industry built around making people scared on purpose." Felt his skin prickle, a fear response in his own species. "That is not normal." "Maybe not," Sarah agreed. "But it worked. We inoculated ourselves against fear by exposing ourselves to it over and over in safe environments. By the time a human is an adult, they have experienced simulated fear thousands of times. They have seen movies where the world ends, read books about cosmic monsters, played games where they die horribly. They know what terror feels like, and they know they can survive it." Over the next few days, Sarah showed him her personal media collection, watched with growing horror as humans created entertainment that was worse than his scientific protocols. They imagined scenarios he had never conceived, terrors that attacked the mind and body and soul in ways he found deeply disturbing. Some of these stories were hundreds of years old and considered classics of human culture. The tattooed man who turned out to be a professional writer of horror fiction was even more disturbing to talk to. He explained his job with enthusiasm. "I get paid to scare people," said cheerfully. "I think of the worst possible things I can imagine, and then I write them down in ways that make people feel like they are really happening. The goal is to terrify the reader so much they cannot sleep." And people want this. Oh yeah, horror is huge. Books, movies, TV shows, podcasts, games, everything. Some of the most successful entertainment in human history has been horror. We love being scared as long as we know we are actually safe. "But why?" asked, genuinely baffled. "What purpose does this serve?" Thought about it. Maybe because life is scary anyway. Bad things happen that we cannot control. People die, disasters strike, things go wrong. We cannot stop being afraid of real dangers, so we practice with fake ones. It gives us a sense of control, I think. Like, I can face this made-up monster and survive, so maybe I can handle whatever real problems come my way. The oversight team arrived a week later. There were 3 of them, all senior researchers from species known for psychological resilience. They reviewed all of his data, checked his equipment, and interviewed the human subjects. Then they insisted on running the protocols themselves, with new human volunteers brought in specifically for this purpose. Watched as the oversight team exposed 6 new humans to the full sequence of scenarios. The results were identical. The humans were stressed and frightened and sometimes tearful, but they never broke. They never stopped thinking. They processed each horror, contextualized it, and moved forward. The oversight team members were not as resilient. All 3 required medical intervention after running Scenario 10. One of them, a warrior named Thorax who had survived 3 planetary wars, was found curled in a ball behind his monitoring station, whispering prayers to gods his species had not believed in for centuries. The humans, meanwhile, offered the oversight team water and awkward but genuine sympathy. One of them, a young woman named, sat with Thorax for an hour, just talking quietly about nothing important until he was calm enough to walk. High researcher, the head of the oversight team and a 6-limbed with blue-gray skin, recovered first. She called a meeting with and demanded answers. "This is not natural," she said, her voice sharp. "Fear is a fundamental survival instinct. You cannot build tolerance to it beyond a certain point without damaging the organism's ability to recognize danger." And yet, gestured at the data screens showing the humans' results. "This is not tolerance," said slowly, studying the patterns. "This is familiarity. They have been doing this to themselves deliberately for their entire cultural history. They have been training themselves to function through existential terror since they lived in caves. Do you understand what this means?" "That they are psychologically resilient beyond any known species," suggested. "That they are psychologically abnormal beyond any known species," corrected. "The question is whether that makes them safe to integrate into the consortium or whether it makes them dangerous." Who had been silently processing everything, finally spoke up. Her color was a troubled purple. "I have been reading human literature, as Doctor suggested. They have a concept called cosmic horror. The idea is that the universe contains things so vast and alien that knowing they exist destroys sanity. They consider this an enjoyable genre of fiction. They find existential dread entertaining," said flatly. "Yes, and they have been writing these stories for over a century." The writer mentioned, "He created an entire mythology of cosmic entities that do not care about humanity at all. Humans find these stories fascinating. Some of their most influential science fiction is based on the premise that we are tiny and meaningless in an uncaring universe." Was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that made blood run cold. "We need to find what actually scares them, what lies beyond their breaking point. Because if we don't and they go out into deep space and encounter something that truly terrifies them, they will not stop. They will not run. They will keep going, and they will drag the rest of us with them into whatever nightmare they find. We need to know their absolute limit. Nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing but had not wanted to voice it. I will design new protocols, deeper ones, but I am not certain we should do this. We must, said firmly. Humanity's membership in the consortium depends on understanding them completely. And more than that, the safety of every species in the consortium depends on knowing what happens when humans encounter true horror. Because based on what I have seen, they will not have the good sense to be paralyzed by it. As the meeting ended and left to file her preliminary report, stood at the observation window and watched the stars. Somewhere out there in the vast darkness were things that had destroyed entire civilizations. Things that the consortium's best minds had encountered only in recordings and fragments, horrors so profound that even the memory of them was quarantined. He thought about the humans down in the residential section, probably watching horror movies or reading scary stories to relax before bed. He thought about Sarah's words about practicing fear for thousands of years, and he wondered if the galaxy was ready for a species that looked directly at the void and said, "Yeah, that's pretty scary, but what is the plan?" Part 3. 3 months passed and exhausted every scenario in the consortium database. The humans experienced simulated extinction events where their sun exploded and their species died screaming. They endured reality dissolution where the laws of physics stopped working and their bodies became impossible geometries. They faced scenarios where everyone they loved was replaced by perfect copies that were subtly wrong, where their own identities were stripped away layer by layer, where they were isolated for subjective centuries in infinite white rooms. After each scenario, they sat in the recovery area and discussed it. They compared the experiences to human fiction. They rated them on intensity. Sometimes they offered suggestions for how to make them scarier. The identity dissolution one was pretty good, said after one particularly brutal session. But it would be worse if you kept one memory, just one, and made us watch it slowly corrupt and change. The total loss is scary, but the slow loss is worse. That is what dementia is like for humans, and we are all terrified of it. Added notes to his files with shaking hands. The humans were not just resistant to fear. They were analyzing it, learning from it, turning it into data. They treated psychological horror like a technical problem to be solved. The consortium was becoming seriously concerned. Daily reports went back and forth. Some members argued for quarantine, keeping humanity isolated until they could be understood better. Others suggested intensive study, hoping to unlock the secrets of human resilience and share them with other species. A few radical voices called for the immediate rejection of humanity's application. They were too different, too strange, too willing to walk into nightmares that would destroy anyone else. Returned to the station with new authorization and a troubled expression on her gray-blue face. She found in his office, surrounded by data screens and empty cups of stimulant beverages. "I have approval for Scenario 0, she said quietly. Looked up sharply. "That is not a scenario. Those are real memories, real experiences of species that were broken by actual cosmic horror." "I know," said, "but we are out of options. We have thrown everything theoretical at the humans and they absorb it like water into sand. We need to expose them to something real, something that truly destroyed minds. It is the only way to find their limits." Scenario 0 was not a simulation. It was a collection of neural recordings from 3 different civilizations that had encountered something in deep space that shattered them completely. They had found patterns in cosmic radiation that revealed a truth they could not accept. They had discovered structures between galaxies that should not exist. They had made contact with something that answered back in ways that destroyed their entire concept of consciousness. All 3 civilizations had collapsed within years of their discoveries. Billions of individuals experiencing simultaneous psychological breakdowns. The recordings had been preserved as warnings, stored in the consortium's most secure archives. No one had ever voluntarily experienced them. If we do this, said slowly, we could cause permanent damage. These are not simulations calibrated for safety. These are actual cognitive hazards. I know, repeated, but the consortium demands answers. Will you proceed? Thought about the humans he had come to know over the past months. Sarah with her steady eyes and quiet strength, with his enthusiasm for terrible ideas, who sat with Thorax until he was calm. All of them were volunteers who had trusted him to push them to their limits. Now he was going to push them beyond what any being should have to endure. I will ask for a volunteer, he said finally. I will not order this. Sarah volunteered immediately. Of course she did. When explained what Scenario Zero actually was, she just nodded and said, "That is what we need to know, right? If we can handle the real thing." "You may not be able to handle this," said carefully. "This is not a test. This is exposure to genuine cognitive hazards that destroyed entire civilizations." "I understand," Sarah said. "Let's do it." The session began at midnight station time. Sarah sat in the neural interface chair while carefully loaded the first recording. The experience. He watched her biometrics carefully, his hand hovering over the emergency cutoff. Sarah's stress responses spiked immediately. Her breathing became ragged. Sweat appeared on her forehead, but her cognitive functions remained active. After 20 minutes, he loaded the second recording. The discovery. Sarah made a small sound of pain but did not signal to stop. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair hard enough that he heard the material creak. The third recording was the worst. The contact event. Almost stopped it on his own, watching Sarah's body shake and tears run down her face. But her eyes remained focused, her breathing deliberate. She was still there, still conscious, still processing. 4 hours after it began, the session ended. Sarah sat in the chair, pale and shaking, rushed to her side with and the medical team behind him. "I am so sorry," he said. "I never should have." Sarah held up a trembling hand. "I'm okay. Give me a minute, just give me a minute." She took several deep, shaking breaths. Her hands slowly unclenched from the chair arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. "That was the worst thing I have ever experienced. The recording, what they encountered out there in the dark between galaxies. God, that was bad." "You should rest," urged. "We can discuss this later." "It was a pattern," Sarah continued, as if she had not heard him. They saw a pattern in the cosmic microwave background radiation, a message or a structure or maybe a living thought, something so vast it uses galaxies as neurons, and they realized they were inside it, inside something's mind, something that was either dreaming them or had already forgotten them, and their entire existence was less than a stray thought to it. Nodded slowly. Yes, that was what destroyed them. 70 billion individuals, all experiencing the same existential collapse within hours of the discovery, the largest psychological catastrophe in recorded history. "Yeah," Sarah said softly, "that would do it. That would do it to us too, I think. If we believed it absolutely, if we could not question it or investigate it or find another explanation, if it was just a truth we had to accept." She looked at him with red, exhausted eyes. "Is that what you needed to know, that we can break?" But was staring at the neural scans with growing horror. "Sarah, you are still functional. Your cognitive systems are stressed, severely stressed, but they are still operational. You are processing this. How are you still thinking?" Sarah laughed, a brittle, painful sound. "Because it might not be true. Because even if it is true, maybe that thing doesn't know we are here. Because even if it knows and doesn't care, we still have lives to live and people to love and problems to solve." She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "Because what else are we going to do? Stop existing? Give up? Lay down and die from existential dread?" She stood up slowly, leaning on the chair for support. "I'm not saying I'm okay. This is going to give me nightmares for years. I am definitely going to need therapy, a lot of therapy, but I am still here, still thinking, still me. That is the human thing, isn't it, Doctor? We keep going. We have always kept going, even when it hurts, even when we are terrified, even when we know deep down that the universe is vast and cold and doesn't care if we live or die. We keep going anyway. Reviewed all the data over the following week. The Oversight Committee met in closed sessions for days. Finally, they called and delivered their assessment. Humanity is cleared for consortium membership, announced, but with a special notation in their file. They are psychologically resilient to a degree that borders on pathological. Other species should be advised that humans may proceed into situations that would be considered extreme psychological hazards. They should also be advised that if humans are frightened enough to retreat from something, everyone else should run twice as fast and not ask questions. Added his own note to the official report. He spent 3 days writing it, trying to capture what he had learned. The final version read, "In 30 years I have never encountered a species that frightened me. Until now. Not because humans are fearless. They are not. They experience fear as deeply as any species I have studied. But they have spent their entire evolutionary history being afraid and functioning anyway. They have practiced fear in their stories and games and entertainment until terror became familiar. They have asked the big questions about meaning and purpose and existence, and they have learned to live without certain answers. When faced with the worst psychological horrors in the consortium's records, horrors that destroyed entire civilizations, humans experienced severe distress but continued to function. The question is not what humans will do when they encounter cosmic horror in deep space. The question is what cosmic horror will do when it encounters humans who look directly at it, acknowledge it is terrifying, and then ask, okay, but what is the plan? 6 months after humanity joined the consortium, a deep space expedition encountered an anomaly near the galactic rim. The moment the non-human crew members saw it, they collapsed with complete psychological breakdowns. The human members of the crew immediately took over, established quarantine protocols, and called for backup while continuing to study the phenomenon from a safe distance. Their report was titled Preliminary Analysis of Spatial Temporal Designation Fear 001, and Why It Is Actually Not That Bad Once You Get Used to It. The report was thorough, professional, and included detailed safety recommendations. It also included an appendix listing several hundred human horror novels, films, and games as recommended preparation materials for personnel who may encounter similar phenomena. The Consortium Safety Board spent 3 weeks debating whether to classify the reading list as a training resource or a quarantine hazard. They eventually decided on both. Sarah wrote a memoir about her experience called I Survived Alien Therapy: How Humanity's Worst Nightmares Became Our Greatest Strength. It became a bestseller in human space and was quietly purchased by several consortium species trying to understand what they had gotten themselves into by accepting humanity as members. Wrote a horror novel based on the recordings, carefully fictionalized to avoid classification issues. It was nominated for multiple awards. The dedication read, "To the consortium researchers who tried to break us. Thanks for the inspiration. You really should have known better." Kept working at the research station, but he never tested humans again. He had learned everything he needed to know. Sometimes late at night, he would stand at the observation window and look out at the stars, thinking about what was out there in the darkness. Things that had destroyed civilizations. Things that waited in the spaces between galaxies. Things that even the consortium's oldest and species feared to name. And somewhere out there, humans were going to find those things. They were going to look right at them, experience appropriate terror, and then figure out how to deal with them. Because that was what humans did. They had always done it. They had practiced for thousands of years, telling each other scary stories around fires, preparing themselves for a universe that was full of things that wanted to hurt them. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant when a prey species evolved into persistent hunters who never stopped, even when they were afraid. Especially when they were afraid. Found this absolutely terrifying, and he suspected the universe would too.